Welcome to episode 6 of Motor City UK. I'm Rob Capaldi. As always, let me start with a huge thank you to everyone who continues to listen, follow and support the podcast. It's been great to see so many people engaging with the story of Coventry's extraordinary automotive and transportation industry. In episode 1, we explored the origins of Coventry's motor industry, from bicycles and sewing machines through to the rapid emergence of the city as the centre of the UK's car industry in the early 20th century. Coventry's story didn't stop there. The decades that followed the Second World War would become the most transformative period in the city's industrial history. The Blitz left huge parts of the city destroyed, factories damaged, streets erased, thousands of homes lost. But from that devastation emerged something entirely new, a rebuilt city shaped around modernity, industry and movement. As Coventry reconstructed, its motor industry morphed and expanded alongside it. Jaguar moved to Browns Lane. Roots grew into a significant industrial group. Standard, Triumph and countless suppliers helped turn the city into a global manufacturing powerhouse. Cars built in Coventry were exported around the world, while the rebuilt city itself became a symbol of post-war optimism and modern British design. Beneath that growth, tensions were beginning to emerge. Industrial disputes, consolidation, foreign competition and changing economics gradually reshaped the city and the companies that once seemed untouchable. In this episode, we continue our journey through Coventry Transport Museum with renowned local historian Damian Kimberley to explore Coventry's post-war reconstruction, the rise of large-scale manufacturing and the long, complicated road from industrial confidence to the end of mass car production in the city. From shadow factories and export markets to Ryton, Browns Lane and the final years of volume manufacturing in Coventry, this is the story of how the city rebuilt itself after the war and how the motor industry became inseparable from its identity. The air raid on Coventry on the night of 14th of November 1940 was the single most concentrated attack on a British city in the Second World War. Codenamed Midnight Sonata, the raid lasted for 11 hours and involved nearly 500 Luftwaffe bombers. The German Air Force dropped 500 tons of high explosives, 30,000 incendiaries and 50 landmines. Coventry lost not only its great medieval church of St Michael's, the only English cathedral to be destroyed in the Second World War, but its central library and market hall, hundreds of shops and public buildings, and the 16th century palace yard, once home to Princess Elizabeth, daughter of King James II. More than 43,000 homes, just over half the city's housing, was damaged or destroyed in the raid. The city that had become Britain's industrial engine suddenly found itself at the centre of one of the most devastating attacks of the Second World War. The fire at the city's huge Daimler works was one of the biggest of the war in Britain. Up to 150 high explosive bombs and 3,000 incendiaries turned 15 acres of factory buildings into a raging inferno. After the war, the city became a symbol for modernisation, with the city centre undergoing a significant redesign and modernisation to bring it firmly into the second half of the 20th century. The car industry in the city tracked with the development of the infrastructure, housing and social amenities, modernising in line with the wider development of British industry through the post-war years.
I think if we were to ask people what Coventry is famous for, one of the things they're likely to say is the Blitz and the damage that was done. How important was Coventry in supporting the war effort? Were the manufacturers turned over to manufacture military vehicles?
It was, Coventry, a lot of fuselages for aeroplanes, things like that. And that's why it was so... That's why it was hit. Probably, on a scale like no other city in the country saw at that time. And again, because it was all mostly concentrated in and around the city centre, which is why, a lot of other significant historic buildings were hit too.
Was the damage that was done there clearly was a cultural damage that was done just to the morale of the people that were here. What damage did it have on industry? There must have been factories that were completely destroyed. Did companies cease to exist because of that?
No, not really, not so many. I mean, they were incredibly astute in getting up and running again. As I said before, Triumph at Priory Street quickly got something in Warwick, just to keep them going until something else came along. They very, very quickly adapted.
Coventry's industrial base had grown organically through the decades. Before the war, factories sat beside terraced housing, workshops filled former medieval streets. Engineering was taking place in almost every corner of the city. That concentration had once powered extraordinary industrial growth. During the war, it also made Coventry vulnerable.
They already started to build what we know as like shadow factories on the outskirts of Coventry. So Browns Lane, for example, was a Daimler shadow factory.
What do you mean by shadow factory? Can you explain what that term is?
I think they were built to push manufacturing outside of the city, but also to disguise and what they were actually making as well.
So were they dummy factories with nothing inside, or were they manufacturing less kind of critical parts?
Yeah, a bit of both really. But so you had the Banner Lane one, which was also become Massey Ferguson, and then I think Humber or the Roots Group at that time built one on Folly. Yeah, Brighton, of course.
Yeah. The name Shadow Factory sounds secretive, hidden, almost cinematic. The reality was more practical than mysterious. By the mid-1930s, Britain knew another European war was becoming increasingly likely. The government needed aircraft, engines, and military equipment produced at a scale that the country simply wasn't capable of. The quickest solution wasn't to start from scratch, it was to turn to the embedded manufacturing industry across the country. Coventry was, of course, a key part of this effort. Skills developed through bicycle, motorcycle, and motor vehicle manufacturing could be transferred remarkably into aircraft production. Around Coventry, huge new factories began appearing. At Banner Lane, on what had been open land and a golf course to the west of the city, was one of the largest shadow factories. Managed by the Standard Motor Company, it produced Bristol Hercules aero engines, enormous 14-cylinder radial engines used in aircraft like the Beaufighter bomber. Elsewhere, as mentioned by Damian, Browns Lane was set up and managed by the founding firm of the motor industry in Coventry, Daimler. At the time, it sat beyond the edge of the city, surrounded largely by countryside near Olseley. These weren't small workshops hidden away behind brick walls. These factories were enormous, long, low industrial buildings. Many were deliberately designed to resemble ordinary industrial premises from the air. Camouflage schemes were added during the war. Some even incorporated decoy features intended to confuse German reconnaissance. In many ways, this was the moment Coventry truly became an industrial city on a global scale. Not just a place that built cars, but a place capable of a coordinated mass production at extraordinary speed. The war accelerated everything. Production methods evolved, supply chains expanded, workforces grew dramatically, including huge numbers of women entering engineering and assembly roles for the first time. When the war finally ended, these shadow factories didn't disappear. Instead, they became the foundations of Coventry's post-war motor industry. Banner Lane shifted from aircraft engines to Ferguson tractors. Browns Lane evolved into Jaguar's long-term home. Roots made Brighton their headquarters. This was a pattern that repeated itself all over the country. The legacy of the shadow factories is still there in Crewe, home to Bentley Motors, and at Castle Brom and Solihull, where Land Rover produced their growing range of cars. The infrastructure built for the war became the infrastructure of Britain's industrial recovery.
Well, it's not just about rebuilding the factories, it's about rebuilding some sort of stability for anyone that's living in Coventry at that time. City centre was completely ripped apart. So the architects used that opportunity to create something quite modern.
Indeed.
Which was welcomed at the time. You know, a lot of people who were probably living in accommodation with still toilets in the bottom of the garden could move into a high-rise flat with central heating, hot running water and their own toilets. So yeah, so there was that going on, a modern, pedestrianised shopping precinct. You know, it was something that I think most Coventry people really look forward to and embraced. And a lot of these factories, as I say, Jaguar then was started. They still got the Radford site on sort of Middlemarch Road. Sandy Lane was all but destroyed.
Yeah.
So hence why they moved into the Daimler Shadow Factory on Browns Lane, which is where they stayed famously for decades after that.
So post-war Coventry became a symbol of modern Britain. When people talk about the city after the war, they often focus on what was lost, The medieval streets, the old workshops and factories, the dense network of buildings that had evolved over centuries around industry, trade, and everyday life. And of course, the bombing itself left scars that were impossible to ignore. But Coventry's post-war story wasn't simply about recovery, it was about reinvention. Even before the Blitz, planners within the city council already believed Coventry had outgrown itself. Medieval street plans struggled to cope with a rapidly expanding industrial city built around cars, factories, and movement. Donald Gibson, appointed as Coventry's first city architect in 1938, at just 29 years old, had already begun imagining a completely different kind of city. Then the bombing came, and suddenly, devastatingly, those radical plans became not only a possibility, but a necessity. What emerged in the years that followed was one of the most ambitious reconstruction projects anywhere in post-war Britain. Wide open civic spaces replaced tight medieval streets. Traffic was separated from pedestrians. The precinct became one of the first large-scale pedestrianised shopping centres in Europe. To modernise, some of it can feel severe, concrete, angular, uncompromising. But at the time, this was optimism and modernism made physical. For a population that had endured years of war, rationing and destruction, this carried huge emotional weight. Central heating, bright shop fronts, wide walkways, clean lines, space, light, air. Coventry wasn't trying to recreate the past, it was trying to build a future. And in many ways, the motor industry sat at the centre of that future, because while the city itself was being rebuilt, Coventry's factories were expanding at extraordinary speed. The wartime shadow factories that had once produced aero engines and military equipment now turned towards civilian production. Jaguar solidified their position in Browns Lane, Standard expanded at Canley, Roots developed massive operations at Ryton and Stoke. The parallels between the city and industry were impossible to miss. The architecture of the new Coventry mirrored the styling of the cars themselves, sleeker, cleaner surfaces, confidence in technology, confidence in progress. You can almost imagine someone stepping out of a newly built flat overlooking a rebuilt city and stepping into a new Standard Vanguard or Triumph Herald parked outside. Both represented movement away from austerity and towards something aspirational. By the 1950s and 60s, Coventry had become a symbol of post-war industrial confidence. Factories operated around the clock, shift sirens defined the rhythm of the city, entire communities revolved around the car industry, and prosperity was visible everywhere. New housing estates spread outwards across the edges of the city, roads widened, the infamous Ring Road appeared. The rebuilt city centre became a showcase for a modern, motorised Britain. Planners and architects from around the world came to study Coventry's reconstruction. In the same way, British cars poured outwards into export markets across Europe, North America, and the Commonwealth. For a brief period, the city and industry seemed completely inseparable. But there's something else that lingers beneath Coventry's reconstruction story, a sense that progress always carries compromise. Some people never stopped mourning the old city that disappeared beneath the bombs and bulldozers. Even today, debates continue about whether Coventry lost too much of itself in the pursuit of modernity. And in hindsight, there's a strange parallel there too, because the motor industry that helped rebuild Coventry would eventually face its own questions about scale, speed, and permanence. The same confidence that built the new city also assumed prosperity would last indefinitely. For a while it did, but not forever.
You've not got, the scores and scores of manufacturers anymore. Cycling's all but finished.
Yeah.
If anything.
Was that due to lower cost manufacturing in other regions?
Yeah, I think it wasn't there. It wasn't, other places like Nottingham, Raleigh, Birmingham, Hercules, Phillips, those kind of manufacturers and the famous names like Triumph and Rudge, Coventry Eagle, they actually got bought up by other companies. So, yeah, you're probably down to about 10 or 15 key manufacturers in Coventry. Roots at this point took over. They started to buy up companies in the 20s. So they owned the names of like Hillman, Humber, Sunbeam Talbot, Comma, Carrier. But so they're making lots of different brands under the same huge factory.
Were they the first to do that? We see that all the time now. The big conglomerates of multi-manufacturers. Were Roots the first to create that type of organisation?
I believe so. I mean, certainly in terms of Coventry. I mean, I think Roots were certainly one of the first to sort of identify a couple of
group,
firms.
And you didn't have a Roots branded vehicle, but you had a family of brands that were owned by Roots.
That's right.
Yeah.
And at the time when they bought Humber and Hillman, they were two separate entities, but they were located next door to each other in the Stoke part of Coventry. So,
If Jaguar became Coventry's glamour brand, then Roots was something altogether different, bigger, broader, more industrial in scale. At its height, the Roots Group wasn't building cars for the elite or the enthusiast alone. It was building transport for post-war Britain itself. Hillmans for suburban driveways, Humbers for managers and ministers, Sunbeams for aspirational motorists, Commer vans and trucks for businesses rebuilding the country. And yet, unlike many of Coventry's manufacturers, Roots didn't actually begin as a car company at all. Its origins lay in a small family business in Kent run by William Roots, a cycle and vehicle dealer. But it was his sons, William and Reginald Roots, who transformed it into something far more ambitious during the early decades of the 20th century. The two brothers couldn't have been more different in temperament. William Roots was the salesman, charismatic, outward-facing, politically connected. Reginald was quieter, methodical, deeply focused on organisation and production. Together they formed an extraordinarily effective partnership. Rather than immediately manufacturing their own cars, the Roots brothers first built a nationwide distribution empire. By the 1920s, they were one of Britain's largest vehicle distributors, selling everything from luxury cars to commercial vehicles. They understood dealerships, finance, logistics, and advertising, long before many traditional manufacturers properly grasped their importance. And crucially, they understood consolidation. At a time when Britain's car industry was crowded with dozens upon dozens of vulnerable independent manufacturers, the Roots brothers saw strength in scale. So during the 1920s and 30s, they began acquiring companies: Hillman, Humber, Commer, Sunbeam, Talbot, and more. Names that had once operated independently slowly became part of the expanding Roots empire. And Coventry became the centre of it all. Factories spread across Stoke and Brighton and further afield, later adding a plant in Linwood in Scotland. Huge industrial sites employing tens of thousands of people. Entire communities became tied to Roots production lines and shift patterns. What's fascinating about Roots is that it helped pioneer something we now take completely for granted: the multi-brand automotive group. Today, companies routinely share platforms, engines, and engineering across multiple marques. But in Britain, during the interwar years, Roots was one of the first major firms to fully embrace that model. Different badges, different audiences, but increasingly shared infrastructure underneath. A Humber might appeal to conservative professional buyers, a Hillman to growing middle-class families, a Sunbeam to drivers wanting something sporty and modern. Different identities, all emerging from the same industrial ecosystem. The Second World War accelerated the importance of Roots dramatically. As already mentioned, the company took responsible for the Wright and Shadow factory, focusing efforts on the production of aircraft parts and military vehicles. The company became deeply integrated into Britain's war effort and emerged from the conflict larger, more influential, more industrially significant than ever before. And in the optimistic years that followed, Roots became one of the defining faces of post-war British manufacturing. This was the age of export culture. Cars leaving British docks bound for Australia, New Zealand, Africa, Europe, and North America. Britain desperately needed export revenue after the war, and manufacturers like Roots were a central part of that recovery. The company leaned heavily into modernity. The advertising from the 50s and 60s is full of confidence, streamlined styling, American influence, two-tone paintwork, wraparound windscreens, the promise of upward mobility. You can almost see post-war Britain teaching itself optimism through the shape of its cars. Roots wasn't merely selling vehicles, it was selling aspiration at scale. The Hillman Minx became one of the defining family cars of mid-century Britain, introduced before the war but continuously reinvented afterwards. It evolved through generation after generation as the country modernised around it.
Hillman Minx, hugely successful, affordable car.
That's an incredible lifetime that this has got. It was introduced in 1932 and ran for the next 38 years.
Yeah.
A vehicle with a 38-year lifespan seems unconceivable now.
It does, doesn't it? Obviously under very, very different stylistic changes along the way.
So we see quite a variety of different vehicle types in this room, from small 4-seat family cars to two-door sports cars and larger luxury cars.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you look at Roots again, they were making everything under several different brands. So, Hillman was their go-to popular, affordable family car. Humber, slightly more upmarket, larger vehicles, right the way up until sort of Sunbeam Talbot, which would have been your more sportier vehicles. So they catered for everybody under the same factory.
By the late 1960s, the world was changing faster than many British firms could adapt to. Competition from Europe intensified, manufacturing became increasingly complex, profit margins tightened, industrial disputes became more frequent across the sector, and Roots, despite its size, began to look vulnerable. By the mid-1960s, the American giant Chrysler had started buying into the company. Gradually, control shifted away from the Roots family entirely. The old marks survived for a while, and slowly, one by one, the names disappeared. Today, many people remember the individual cars more vividly than the company itself, the Minx, the Imp, Sunbeam, Lotus. But for several decades, Roots helped define the industrial rhythm of Coventry and the West Midlands. Not through one iconic sports car or a single glamorous brand, but through sheer scale, through factories, shift changes, exports, office workers, tool makers, families whose entire working lives revolved around the company. For a time, Roots represented something very particular about post-war Britain, the belief the industry could be modern, ambitious and permanent. And like so much of Coventry's automotive story, that confidence would eventually prove harder to sustain than anyone imagined.
Is this the period where Coventry was at its most influential in the global automotive sector?
I think that times had already sort of gone. I think by this point it's quite volatile, really. There is a lot going on, but there's lots of trade disputes as well going on in Coventry at that time. But I think that was reflective in the whole country politically as well.
By the late 1960s, Coventry had reached a strange and uneasy point in its history. On the surface, the city still looked like the capital of British motoring. The factories were enormous, production lines stretched across the outskirts of the city. Cars built in Coventry were being exported around the world. Jaguar had become a global symbol of British engineering sophistication. Roots products filled suburban driveways from Glasgow to Cape Town, but beneath that confidence, something had begun to shift. The city that had once thrived on hundreds of independent firms had become concentrated into a small number of giant industrial employers. What had once been a flexible ecosystem of specialist makers was now a tightly interconnected manufacturing machine. And that meant problems travelled quickly. If one factory stopped, suppliers stopped. If suppliers stopped, production slowed elsewhere. If production slowed, tensions spread. And increasingly, tensions did spread. Part of the problem was scale. Coventry's success after the war had been built on consolidation. Companies merged, brands disappeared into larger groups. The city's motor industry had become larger, more complex, and more vulnerable. Factories like Wright and Canley and Banner Lane employed thousands of people. Entire districts of Coventry revolved around shift patterns, production targets, and wage negotiations. The motor industry wasn't simply part of the city anymore, it was the city. And for many workers, there was growing frustration beneath the prosperity. Britain's post-war industrial model had begun to strain under inflation, rising competition from Europe and Japan, outdated factory practices, and inconsistent management. Coventry found itself directly at the centre of all of these pressures. Strikes became increasingly common through the late 60s and into the 70s, sometimes local, sometimes national, sometimes lasting only hours, sometimes shutting entire production lines for weeks. And yet from inside, the situation looked more complicated than the headlines suggested. For many workers, these weren't abstract political battles. There were arguments about pay keeping pace with inflation, about conditions inside aging factories, about job security in an industry that was beginning to feel less certain than it once had. The optimism of post-war Reconstruction had been built on an assumption that industrial growth would continue indefinitely. Coventry's modern shopping precincts, ring road and housing developments all reflected that confidence. But by the 1970s, the future suddenly felt less stable. Foreign competition intensified, new manufacturing methods emerged overseas. British factories that once seemed unstoppable increasingly struggled with quality problems, inefficiency, and underinvestment. Some companies adapted, others simply ran out of time. Slowly, Coventry began losing something that had once defined it, not simply factories, but control of its own industrial destiny.
So, yeah, we're kind of almost saying goodbye to it. Not completely, but it's all being very much condensed down to maybe 2 or 3 players at this point, rather than at one point, sort of in the 20s, you might have had 30 companies. Now you've got 3.
Yeah, we've quite quickly progressed from the post-war period where there was a need for redevelopment and a need to rebuild morale and the positivity of the new architecture that was going into the city and the rebirth of Coventry. Within the next maybe 20 or 30 years, we've gone over a peak to the point where there's labour disputes and there's almost civil unrest in the manufacturing sector across the UK. I guess Coventry was central to that, given the large manufacturing base that was here.
Yeah,
and yet during this period of instability, Coventry continued building remarkable machines: the Triumph Stag, a long line of Jaguars, the Hillman Avenger, the TR7. There's a poignancy to many of these cars now, not because they represented failure, but because they were built by an industry still capable of brilliance, even as the foundations beneath it were beginning to shift. Inside the factories, people still turned up every morning believing they were building the future. By the end of the 1970s, Coventry's motor industry had entered a very different phase of its life. The city still built cars, huge numbers of them in fact, but the sense of certainty that had once surrounded the industry was beginning to disappear. Factories that had once represented permanence now felt vulnerable. Entire companies seemed to dissolve and reform every few years under different badges and different management structures. And across the city, people began quietly adjusting to the idea that the great industrial age of the city might not last forever. At Canley, Standard Triumph gradually faded into British Leyland's wider restructuring plans. Production contracted, jobs disappeared in waves rather than all at once. For decades, Canley had been one of the defining industrial landscapes of Coventry. Thousands of workers moving through the gates every day, entire communities built around the rhythms of the factory. And slowly, piece by piece, it began to disappear, finally closing its doors in 1980. At Browns Lane, Jaguar survived, though survival often felt uncertain. Through the 80s and 90s, the company passed through successive owners, investment cycles, and reinventions. Yet despite everything, Jaguars continued to emerge from Coventry, carrying the same quiet sense of occasion they always had. For many local families, Jaguar retained an almost emotional importance, not simply because of the cars themselves, but because Browns Lane represented continuity, a thread connecting Coventry's industrial past to its present. Meanwhile, out at Ryton, the old Roots Shadow factory carried on adapting to whatever industry demanded next. Hillman became Chrysler, Chrysler became Talbot, Talbot became Peugeot. The signage outside changed more often than the buildings themselves.
So we've entered a room full of Peugeots. Obviously, the end of the Ryton plant, it became a Peugeot plant after the Roots. Then
it did.
Then Chrysler, as you mentioned, it ended up as Peugeot. And there's some instantly recognisable vehicles here that I assume were made in that plant.
That's right, yeah. So they didn't make the whole range of Peugeot. There were still obviously other factories that were building some of the models, but yeah, the 405 and the 206 probably one of the most common sort of vehicles that come out of Ryton at that point.
Generations of Coventry workers continued doing what they'd always done, building cars with extraordinary speed, skill and resilience. By the 1980s, Ryton had become the city's last great volume production plant. Cars like the Peugeot 306 and 206 rolled out of the factory in huge numbers, many destined for export markets far beyond Britain. For younger workers entering the industry, Ryton was no longer simply a Coventry factory, it was the Coventry factory, the final large-scale link to the city's mass manufacturing identity. But by then, the wider economics of car production had changed dramatically. Manufacturing increasingly moved towards larger international platforms, global supply chains and lower-cost production centres elsewhere in Europe and beyond. Britain's old industrial geography no longer carried the same advantages it once had. In Coventry, the city that had helped invent the modern British motor industry, found itself trying to compete in a world that looked very different from the one it had dominated just after the war. By the 1990s, only 3 factories remained: Ryton and Browns Lane, producing Peugeots, Jaguars and Daimlers, and the less talked about Holyhead Road facility that produced one of the most iconic cars to leave Coventry. The company that became London Taxis International had roots stretching back to the interwar years when car bodies began producing vehicle bodies in Coventry. Over time, the company evolved into something deeply associated with Britain itself. The London Taxi became one of the world's most recognisable vehicles, not exotic, not fast, and certainly not glamorous, but dependable, purposeful, and unmistakably British, and crucially, still built in Coventry.
We're now coming much more up to date with TX4 London Taxi. London Taxis are really the only vehicle manufacturer as such that has a production site in any kind of volume in Coventry.
Yeah, I mean, they're based at Anstey, aren't they now,
Yeah.
I think, which is slightly just outside. But yeah, another fascinating history. They began in just after the First World War at Holyhead Road as car bodies. And then, I think it was the 40s began to make the iconic taxi, and the design pretty much stayed the same for the next 30 years. It became iconic around the world, and we're fortunate to still have that association.
You could almost say that the London Taxi is as iconic as a symbol of the UK as a red telephone box or Buckingham Palace. It's
police officer,
instantly recognisable.
It really is.
Yeah.
The iconic black cab represents something different to the other cars which have called Coventry home. It's a vehicle shaped around utility, around service, around the realities of everyday urban life. Unlike the many other brands we've spoken about, it survived, with the London Electric Vehicle Company, now owned by the Chinese giant Geely, keeping the head office and significant manufacturing plant in Coventry. The London Taxi remains one of the only vehicles of any significant volume produced in the city. In 2007, the Peugeot factory at Ryton closed its doors. For Coventry, it felt more than a loss of a factory. It marked the end of something the city had lived with for over a century, the rhythm of large-scale car production woven into daily life. The future, however, looks brighter for Coventry. Jaguar retain a presence in the city at the Whitley Engineering Centre, a centre of excellence for the development of JLR's powertrain technologies. And less well known at Ryton, of all places, where JLR Special Vehicles, JLR Classic, and their prototype shop have cutting-edge facilities on the site of the former Roots factory. As mentioned, LEVC have a spectacular manufacturing site at Anstey, next door to the Manufacturing Technology Centre, home to the UK government's efforts to ignite high-tech manufacturing across multiple sectors, including automotive. So, while mass production may have gone, Coventry continues to reinvent itself through research, electrification, advanced engineering, and new forms of mobility that are beginning to shape the future of transport across the West Midlands. You can read more about Coventry's automotive, motorcycle and bicycle history in Damian's books. Links are available in the show notes below. A huge thank you again to the Coventry Transport Museum for welcoming us and making the exhibits available outside of normal opening hours, so we could record without the usual background noise of a busy museum day. If you haven't visited before, the museum is well worth your time, not simply for the cars themselves, but for the way it helps tell the wider story of Coventry and the industries that shaped it. You can also follow the museum on Instagram at CovTM. While you're there, you can follow the podcast too. We're at Motor City Pod. You'll find behind-the-scenes content, updates on future episodes, and more from the places, people, and vehicles connected to Britain's original Motor City. And finally, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do follow the podcast on your app of choice. Leave a review and give us a 5-star rating. It really helps more people discover these stories. Join us next time as we continue exploring Coventry's unique relationship with transport, engineering, and the motor car.